Welcome to Bankless, where we explore the frontier of internet money and internet finance. This is how to get started, how to get better, and how to front run the opportunity. I'm Ryan Sean Adams. I'm here with David Hoffman, and we're here to help you become more bankless. David, we have Vitalik on once again. What topics do we cover?
Yeah, we cover 3 of his most recent blogs on his Vitalik.ca blog. These are all fantastic reads. And in order to help amplify Vitalik's message and try and get out what he's trying to get out, we go through each of these blog pieces together. We start with his recap of 2020 and his forward-looking, kind of his forward-looking predictions into 2021. That blog was particularly interesting. That's how we start the conversation. We move into his blog post called An Incomplete Guide to Rollups, and he kind of helps us unpack what it is to be a rollup, how we as an Ethereum L2 scaling community landed on rollups as a construction, and why they are so powerful. And then we also get into the topic of social recovery wallet. So these are all relatively 3 different topics, but I would say they are all forward-looking topics that Vitalik sees as kind of like the logical conclusion of a lot of different forces. Perhaps maybe a lot of them social, a lot of them political in his first blog post that we get into. But then the second 2 are more technological and about the way that Ethereum, the landscape is going to manifest and mature over time. So again, a wide-ranging conversation, but still with a lot of awesome through lines.
Absolutely. If you're listening on the podcast, of course, we have this on YouTube as well, where we actually go through the articles visually. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can check it out on the podcast and get it directly into your ears, make it more portable that way. David, we should just get right into the interview. But before we do, guys, we want to talk about the sponsors that made this episode possible.
If you want to live a bankless life, you need to get a Monolith DeFi Visa card. Monolith is a 1-2 punch of both an Ethereum smart contract wallet and an accompanying Visa card that lets you spend the money that you have in your Ethereum wallet everywhere where Visa is accepted. When you swipe your Monolith Visa card at the grocery store or at a restaurant, it actually makes a transaction on the Ethereum blockchain that spends some of the money you hold in your Monolith wallet. It's insanely cool, and it's one of the best tools out there for living a bankless but still normal life. Monolith also offers ONRAMP services for getting your fiat money into the world of DeFi. So it's trivial to top up your Monolith card if you ever need to, and your deposited money goes straight into your non-custodial wallet, so your money is never held by a centralized intermediary. Because Monolith is native Ethereum infrastructure, the money you hold in your Monolith wallet still has the power of DeFi behind it. Swapping assets on Uniswap or earning yield in DeFi is at your fingertips. Go to monolith.xyz and sign up to get your Monolith Visa card today. If you are looking for a product that connects your fiat bank account with DeFi tokens and products, you need to download the DHARMA mobile app. DHARMA is a non-custodial smart contract wallet and comes with a bridge that connects you right into your bank account. DHARMA is the fastest and most efficient wallet between your fiat in your bank account and any token on Uniswap, or even any vault in Yearn. With DHARMA, you can get over $25,000 per week into the DeFi universe, and you can do it non-custodially. If you or anyone you know is hot on DeFi and you're trying to get your money into a DeFi investment, DHARMA is the place to go. Signing up and going through KYC is an absolute breeze. It took me just under 3 minutes, and after signing into my bank account via Plaid, I am now just 1 transaction away from any token that Uniswap has to offer. Go to www.dharma.io, that's DHARMA.io, download the DHARMA app, and get yourself unbanked today.
This is an incomplete guide to rollups. So Vitalik, can we go through the incomplete guide to rollups? Maybe direct this to someone who has heard about the buzz that maybe rollups are Ethereum's next big scaling solution, right? And it's kind of the promised land of reducing gas fees. Tell us, what are rollups? Where would you like to start with this?
Sure. So rollups are a member of this family of scalability solutions that we call the layer 2 scaling. Right? So like there's this long running dichotomy between layer 1 scaling and layer 2 scaling, where layer 1 scaling says we increase how many transactions we can process by making the blockchain able to process more transactions. And layer 2 scaling says we increase the number of transactions we can process by moving work off chain. And instead of like running everything on chain directly, we only run kind of more limited verification activities on chain. And so we use these more clever contraptions to reduce the need to use the chain in the first place. And in the case of Bitcoin, like this was basically the topic of their civil war. But in the case of Ethereum, we're basically doing layer 1 and layer 2 scaling at the same time, right? We have sharding for layer 1 scaling, but we also have this very kind of healthy and rich layer 2 scaling ecosystem. And I talk about the 3 scaling approaches. So there's channels and plasma and rollups. And channels are this method for optimizing one-to-one interactions. So for example, channels are really good at the use case of like, let's say I'm selling you an internet connection and you want to pay me per megabyte, right? And then like what would happen is that like I would start for giving you an internet connection, and then every time it would reach 1 megabyte, like you would just send me these off-chain messages that I call tickets, right? So your first ticket would be a signed message that just says I'm paying you 0.001. Your second ticket would be a message that says I'm paying you 0.002, and so forth. And the way that this works is that I only needs to actually put on chain the very last ticket or the highest value ticket that you send, right? And so basically what you're doing is you're making these payments, but we're not yet committing them. And you just constantly keep paying more by just replacing these payments with higher value payments. And then when I publish the last payment on chain, I'm basically kind of settling all of these payments at the same time, and it's happening in one transaction. And there is the smart contract implements this kind of interaction game where basically, like, let's say if you try to submit one of your tickets that has a smaller payment, then I can challenge and I can send your ticket that has the higher payment. Or if I just disappear completely, then you can send your own payment or your own ticket to close the channel and get your money back and so on. So channels are good for bidirectional payments, and there are things like the Lightning Network and Raiden that try to expand that out to broader payment networks, but they also do have some weaknesses, right? They're fairly complicated to deal with. They have these high capital requirements and so forth. Then there's Plasma. And Plasma is this very technically clever construction that it turns out Plasma is like really amazing for dealing with non-fungible tokens because it's just like the whole idea with Plasma is that you basically like assign every unit of an asset a different ID, and then you have this kind of Merkle tree contraption where you basically, if an asset has some ID X, then the transaction that corresponds to that address goes into a Merkle tree at index X, and then you publish the Merkle roots on chain. And then if someone who has like some asset X wants to withdraw it, then they would publish an operation on chain, and then they would have to provide that Merkle branch. And if someone else wants to challenge them, well, they can do that. And then all the challenges happen like just by providing these Merkle branches. So Plasma is this really clever thing. It's good for asset transfers. It's good for payments. It can be used for exchange. So the OMG network has been doing a great job of kind of pushing the Plasma vision toward its kind of logical conclusion, as basically doing as great a job as can possibly be done with it. So very happy that their work exists. But then we move on to the third solution, which is rollups, right? And rollups are a fascinating class of technology because in some ways they're not a full layer 2 scheme, right? And what I mean by that is that in a traditional layer 2 scheme, all the data and all the computation of at least each additional transaction is fully off chain, right? Like in Plasma, you do have to publish Merkle roots on chain, but that's 32 bytes. It's 32 bytes if there's 10 users, and it's 32 bytes if there's 10,000 users. In a rollup, you have to publish, like, it looks like somewhere around like 10 to 15 bytes of data on chain for every transaction. Now you are able to move all the computation off chain, and you are able to move most of the data on off chain, but you do need to have like some amounts of data on chain for every transaction. And it turns out that the ability to have data on chain basically just gets around some very fundamental game theory issues that have to do with data availability. And in my blog post, I linked to this YouTube video that I made. I think it was in some Stanford conference or meetup or one of those, where I just talk about like why data availability is hard, and like why there's these complicated game theory issues around like you just like basically you can't have a fraud proof system for data the same way you can have a fraud proof system for computation. And rollups or plasma and channels kind of get around this issue by relying on this explicit concept of owners that basically says that like every asset has an owner, and if the owner for that asset misbehaves, then the system can fail, but the system can fail in only one direction, and that direction basically is that the owner loses the asset. But in a rollup, you actually can just make a hard guarantee that says the state definitely will be processed correctly. And it turns out that that's really important if you want applications to become more general purpose, right? Because in more general purpose applications, like it's just you can't map assets to owners, right? Like who's the owner of Uniswap is the easiest example, right? Like there is no single actor who's kind of the logical beneficiary of everything that happens inside of Uniswap. It's just this like automated thing that exists on chain, and it benefits everyone, and it's owned by no one. So then I get into like basically how does a rollup work, right? And the core idea of a rollup is basically that there is a smart contract on chain, and that smart contract maintains a state root. It maintains basically a Merkle hash of all the state inside the rollup. So that means all the account balances, all the contract code, everything inside the rollup. You have this Merkle hash, and that Merkle hash gets maintained by the rollup contract. Anyone can publish what we call a batch, right? And a batch is basically this collection of transactions in this very compressed form, together with basically a record of the previous state root and a record of the new state root. So a batch is basically a claim that says, if you start here, if you start from this state root and you apply these transactions, then this is the new state root. Now, in reality, the batch by itself does not have enough information to fully compute the new state root, because if you want to actually compute that, you need to have the Merkle branches. And of course, you don't actually want to compute all this stuff on chain. So instead, what happens is that the rollup just believes the batches by default, and then you have one of two mechanisms for proving that these batches are correct, right? So one of them is optimistic rollups, and the other is ZK rollups. And here's where we get to the core difference between these two great families of rollups, right? In an optimistic rollup, what you have is a system where you basically kind of trust but verify, right? So the smart contract kind of trusts the batches by default, and it just accepts the results of the batches by default. But then if there are nodes in the network that actually do run the full computation, and if one of them discovers that something is wrong, then they can publish a challenge. And if they get challenged correctly, then the batch that's incorrect gets reverted, and whoever submitted the batch loses their deposit, and the challenger gets a reward, and then you kind of continue from there. So optimistic basically says trust by default, but if someone challenges, then if the thing they challenge is incorrect, then you revert it. And as long as you trust that there's at least somebody online who can revert, then the mechanism works. Now, ZK rollups, they use validity proofs, right? ZK rollups use these kind of fancy cryptographic proofs that we call ZK snarks, and they basically prove directly that the post-state root is a correct result of executing the batch on top of the pre-state root. And the way that these proofs work is really complicated. And I actually, I've tried to make a couple of explanations of this. I'm sure I'll try making more explanations of this in the future. But these are just incredibly powerful and just incredibly clever mathematical contraptions that actually let you make a proof of a computation that takes a long time to compute, where that proof itself can be verified extremely quickly. And this is what ZK rollups rely on. So there's these fairly complicated trade-offs between optimistic and ZK rollups, right? In terms of like the fixed gas cost of each batch, which influences how frequently batches can be published, the withdrawal period. So ZK optimistic rollups, the fixed cost per batch is much smaller, which means batches can be published much more frequently. ZK rollups have instant withdrawals. Optimistic rollups have withdrawals that take 1 week, but the thing that you can do if you want optimistic rollups to have instant withdrawals is you can basically have a kind of third-party market. So basically, like if I have, say, 1 ETH that's being withdrawn in progress, then if you were validating the rollup and you are perfectly confident that that withdrawal is correct, then what you can do is you can just buy my right to 1 ETH for, say, 1 ETH minus a fee. You can just buy up my withdrawal rights for, say, 0.9999 ETH. I would get my 0.9999 ETH immediately, and then you would just wait a week, and then you would get your 1 ETH at the end, right? So,
or your 0.0001 ETH.
No, sorry. I would
no,
get
the total. I see.
right,
Sorry.
right.
Yep.
Right.
Sorry.
I sacrifice my right to 1. Instead, I get 0.9999 immediately. You, as the buyer of the withdrawal, pay me 0.9999 immediately, and you get the full 1 at the end. So, like, this is a technique that's available for optimistic rollups to have instant withdrawals, but it does have capital costs. And importantly, it doesn't work with NFTs because NFTs inherently, like, there is nobody who has like a second copy of the same NFT that they can collateralize. But for coins, it works amazingly. Complexity of technology, optimistic rollups are simpler. Generalizability, optimistic rollups are easier to have kind of full general purpose EVM computation for. And this is something that's really important, right? Like there already are ZK rollups that are live, and ZK rollups, like there's ZK Sync, there's Loopring, there's the Diversify, and those can be application specific, but it's very hard to make them support like much more general purpose computation. Whereas with an optimistic rollup, like, well, we already have one on mainnet that's basically running EVM code on layer 2. And then per transaction on-chain gas costs. So this basically means like, are the on-chain costs that you have to pay per transaction. So this is basically paying for the 16 bytes. It turns out that there's technical reasons why for certain types of transactions you need more bytes in an optimistic rollup than in a ZK rollup. And then there's off-chain computation costs, which are actually lower for optimistic rollups than there are for ZK rollups. So there's complicated trade-offs, but my kind of opinion, summing it all up, is that I think in the short term, optimistic rollups are likely to win for general purpose EVM computation. ZK rollups are likely to win for simple payments and like some very specific use cases. But I do think that, on a 5 to 10 year time horizon, ZK rollups are gonna be winning out in all use cases. So I think like the fact that teams like Optimism and Arbitrum are doing optimistic rollups today is perfectly fine. And I think it's completely the correct path in order to just get some kind of scaling out for Ethereum in 2021. Yeah, but there is going to come a time when ZK Snark technology improves, and ZK Snarks are capable of moving actually verifying EVM computation. Now, expect to see demos of ZK Snarks, doing things like verifying Solidity code this year. But just keep in mind that there's a big difference between a demo and a production implementation, right? Like, because once you have a demo, like you still have to, you have to security audit it, you have to debug it, you have to really make sure that the verifier is correct, and those things are hard, right? Like I personally would much rather trust, $10 million of my own money to an EVM optimistic rollup than to an EVM ZK rollup for at least the next couple of years. But in the long term, ZK rollups I think are going to be everything. And so my advice to teams like Optimism and Arbitrum is that I think they should start kind of ZKifying themselves fairly soon. Like, it's not so urgent that like people should lose interest in projects that are optimistic rollups today. But I think projects that are optimistic rollups today should have the attitude that they are not going to be optimistic rollups forever, and they should have they should start putting together their strategies for ZKing themselves. So then I talk kind of more technically about like, what is a
if I could cut in here, Vitalik, I would just like to clarify one thing between optimistic rollups and ZK rollups. What would you say is the defining characteristic difference between optimistic and ZK rollups that makes you long-term belief in ZK rollups? Like what's the real separation between those two things that makes you optimistic about ZK rollups long-term?
Sure. And one is like just ZK rollups have instant withdrawals even and without any collateral requirements. Another is that ZK rollups do not have this kind of one of n online requirements in order for someone to be able to publish a fraud proof. And that's valuable because like it opens the door for ZK rollups to be able to go up and process things like tens of thousands of transactions per second, where in an optimistic rollup, once you start having that many transactions, then it starts it starts becoming less obvious that there will always be enough honest nodes that are checking that all the computations are done correctly. Also the data efficiency, right? Like the fact that, so I have a table a bit further below where I look at the mixer example, and it's one table further below. There it is, right? Like, and the mixer only has a 77x scalability gain in an optimistic rollup, but a 570x scaling gain in a ZK rollup. And the reason why this is true is because ZK rollups allow you to have less data on chain, because in a ZK rollup, you only need to have enough data on chain to update the state tree. Whereas in an optimistic rollup, you have to have enough data on chain to verify the full computation, which is a slightly larger amount of data. So I don't, now to be very clear, right? I don't think that these advantages are decisive in 2021. And like, I think in 2021, like optimistic rollups and ZK rollups are both totally fine. We're going to have these withdrawal markets. I mean, we're going to have ways for people to withdraw from things like Optimism and Arbitrum instantly. And in 2021 and 2022, and like even going a bit further, the fact that optimistic rollups just rely on clean EVM verification, and like they have surprisingly simple fraud-proof verifiers, I think is a decisive advantage, as opposed to ZK rollups, which needs to have just like this much larger and complicated compiler code to convert Solidity or Viper or EVM into arithmetic representations, and there's just much more attack surface for bugs in there. But like over the longer time horizon, those issues will get resolved, and the calculus is like slowly going to shift toward the ZK side.
So I like to take a stab at trying to go through the history of this to lead into my next question. Ethereum L2 scaling started with state channels, which were, and the great thing about state channels is that, it's just between two parties, you can make any number of transactions without committing anything to the blockchain. And then to wrap up your day, you commit something to the blockchain, that state channel ends, and then you bundle up, 10,000 plus transactions into just one little packet of data, submit it to the blockchain. That's great. And that's great for two parties or just a low number of parties. Plasma was an attempt to have one-to-many or many-to-many type of interactions of various types. And there are different constructions of Plasma that did different things. But it ended up being weak because of this thing called this data availability problem, which in short is that it's hard for Ethereum, the blockchain, to know about the Plasma L2 chains and know about how to manage that without making assumptions. And assumptions, we don't like assumptions in the world of cryptography. That's not how we play in the world of crypto economics. We like things to be secure. And then that turned into the rollups revolution of the optimistic and ZK flavor, where there was a compromise made where we figured out we could actually just regularly submit some data to the Ethereum blockchain to solve that data availability problem. And so we aren't getting like millions of transactions per second. We are still generally bottlenecked, but the actual bottlenecks are actually still pretty wide. And there's lots of optimizations there that can make them even wider. And that's kind of where we are today. How do we know that we are towards the end of this research and development process? How do we know in like 2021 or 2022, we're not going to come up with this new scaling system? What indications or evidence do we have that we have approached the end of this research and development phase?
That's hard to tell for certain. Like, there's no theorem that says that like these are the only scaling mechanisms that exist and there are no others. But I think like there are kind of heuristic arguments that suggest this. Right? I mean, one of them is just the Lindy argument, right? Like we've had channels and plasma and rollups and basically nothing else for something like 4 years now. In rollups themselves, like they were. Like in their current form, they were kind of created in 2018 to 2019, but there was this much earlier thing of shadow chains that I published back in 2014 that kind of is a prelude to rollups. So we've had a kind of long and growing time span within which we've known about these three techniques, and we've seen no others. Another thing that arguments that you can make is this mathematical arguments that basically says, like, if there are end users, how much data gets published on chain, not taking into account deposits and withdrawals and fraud. And you can classify them very easily, right? In a channel, the answer is 0. In a plasma, the answer is O of 1. So just the one Merkle root, regardless of how many users there are. And in a rollup, it's O of N, right? So like there's a bit of data per transaction. And so that basically covers the space, right? Now you might say, well, are there things between 1 and n? Are there things that are like square root or like logarithm or some weird thing in between? And I think my intuitive answer there is just probably not, because that just means that eventually you have less than 1 bit on chain per transaction, and like how much can you actually do with that? But intuitively, it just feels like those three numbers, like 0, 1, and n, just kind of cover the whole range. And you can tell how with increasing on-chain load, you have increasing capability, right? Like Plasma gives you increasing capability from channels. The particular thing being just the ability to send off-chain to new users who have not yet been inducted into the system. And then going from 1 to n, you have this other gain of capability, which is being able to go general purpose. So like there is that kind of heuristic intuitive reason to potentially believe that these three options just are the options out there, and that everything we're going to see from here is just like different permutations on that.
Gemini is the world's most trusted cryptocurrency exchange. I've been a customer of Gemini since I first got back into crypto back in 2017, and it has been my main exchange of choice to make my crypto buys and sells. Gemini is available in all 50 states and over 50 countries worldwide. And on Gemini, there are markets for over 30 various crypto assets, including many of the hot DeFi tokens like YFI, AAVE, Uni, and also they are one of the few exchanges that has liquid DAI markets. Having both the option of logging into the Gemini.com website or instead opening the Gemini mobile app has allowed me to be able to access any and all exchange and on or off ramp services that I've needed to on a moment's notice. With instant deposits and fast withdrawals, I'm able to make my money do the things I want it to when I want it to. You can buy crypto safely and securely on Gemini with the peace of mind of knowing that your investments are insured and protected with industry-leading cybersecurity. You can open up a free account in under 3 minutes at gemini.com/gobankless. And if you trade more than $100 within the first 30 days after signup, you'll be gifted a free $15 bonus. Check them out, gemini.com/gobankless. AAVE is a borrowing and lending protocol on Ethereum, and just recently released AAVE version 2, which has a ton of cool new features that makes using AAVE even more powerful. With AAVE, you can leverage the full power of DeFi, money Legos, yield, and composability all in one application. On AAVE, there are a ton of assets that you can deposit in order to gain yield, and all of those same assets can also be borrowed from the protocol if you have deposited collateral. Here you can see me getting a 200 USDC loan against my portfolio of a number of different DeFi tokens and ETH. I'll choose a variable interest rate because it's a lower rate than the stable interest rate option, but I could choose the stable interest rate option if I wanted to lock that interest rate in permanently. One of AAVE's V2 features is the ability to swap collateral without having to withdraw your assets, trade them on Uniswap, and then deposit them back into AAVE. AAVE does all of this for you all in one seamless transaction, so you don't have to repay loans in order to change the collateral you have backing them. Check out the power of AAVE at aave.com. That's AAVE.com.
Rollups are definitely very exciting. What's also exciting is we can begin using them now, right? So this is no longer hypothetical, theoretical, like Loopring has one in production. Synthetics just released their version on Optimism. So it's going to be very exciting to see how both the optimistic rollups and the ZK rollups play out. I had one other question for you, and then maybe we can move on to social recovery wallets. But just last question on rollups. How does ETH2 kind of, just to tie this out, how does the ETH2 roadmap fit with the rollup roadmap? I understand that ETH2 is going to provide a way to provide consensus on a sharded data layer, which is going to make more space, more sort of bandwidth, I guess, for rollups in the future. What's that going to look like, and what's that going to do for Ethereum's holistic scalability story here?
Great question. It's definitely very important to kind of circle back and answer this one. Basically, so we have this thing called the rollup centric roadmap, which basically says that in the short term, we recognize that there is massive fee pressure, and rollups are the only thing that can relieve the fee pressure no matter what we do. And at the same time, we recognize that for sharding, providing sharding of just data, so just having sharded blocks that just contain these blobs where you might have whatever data you want, but there's no kind of on-chain processing of it, is an easier problem to solve than sharded computation. And so if you take those two facts together, the thing that you realize is basically that, well, what do rollups need? Rollups need data. And what's the scalability limit of a rollup? The scalability limit of a rollup is basically, well, how much data space is there that the chain has a consensus on? And with the current Ethereum chain, that limit is somewhere around 500 kilobytes a block. But with the sharded system, you basically have like 500 kilobytes for each of these 64 blocks in every slot, right? So there's just going to be this much larger amount of space, and within that space, you just you can use that to potentially go up to something like 100,000 transactions per second just with rollups, right? And I have some numbers. I definitely encourage people reading the post. It's also on vitalik.ca. And I talk about some of the tricks that we use for data compression and some of the math that shows like how many data, how many bytes you need for a transaction of different types, and like how much scaling gain you can get on a regular rollup or on a rollup on ETH1, and then multiply that by another 64 to get the scaling gains for rollups on ETH2. And
just to clarify here, Vitalik, so this sharded data layer, is this going to be available to use for rollups before the ETH1 and ETH2 merger?
It can be. There is work that needs to be done for that to happen. Basically, we need an ETH2 light client inside of ETH1. And that technically requires like some EIPs on ETH1 to be done, which I think are like in the pipeline, I believe, for like soon after Berlin or something like that.
Got it. Cool. All right. Well, excellent. This has been a fantastic article. So, of course, an incomplete guide to rollups. I didn't feel like that was incomplete. What about you, David? I felt like that was a very complete guide to rollups.
Yeah.
At least for me.
Maybe that's a good question, Vitalik. What would a complete guide to rollups mention?
Right. And one thing I say is that the guide is already wrong. one of the tables, line 4, general purpose EVM rollups are already close to mainnet. Well, as of now, the Optimism rollup already is on mainnet, at least for synthetics. So that's progress. And I think like this is just a evolving technology, and people are going to come up with new and more clever tricks. And like I wrote this blog post with the goal of it being something that people can kind of go back to and just get their just primer on what the heck rollups are, even for years into the future. So I expect there to be kind of more and more things that end up just inevitably not being part of the post, but that continue improving rollup people's rollup users' experience.
As always, want to end with this. None of this was financial advice, of course. ETH is risky, so is DeFi, so is crypto. You could lose what you put in, but we are headed west. This is the frontier. It's not for everyone, but we're glad you're with us on the Bankless journey. Thanks a lot.